if you took your brain and distilled it into just a few points for people who are stuck in some way in their lives, what are some things you would want them to know based on what you know?
One thing is that if you're conscious, then your mind is working on stuff. So the fact that you're awake and conscious means that you've got this opportunity to work through a problem and to find a way out and to see it in a new way, because that is what our conscious awareness does. All you need to do is help focus it on what's at the root of the problem.
Okay, welcome to the Become Your Own Therapist podcast. Today I am delighted to have Professor Warren Mansell, who is a professor of mental health at Curtin University, Perth, Australia. Originally from the UK, he has authored over 200 peer-reviewed publications, including therapy manuals, edited handbooks, and popular science books. He uses a scientific approach known as perceptual control theory to develop universal and scalable mental health interventions. These include self-help guides, workplace stress management programs, and an artificial therapist smartphone app. So, Professor Mansell, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Yeah, so I was speaking to you just before we hit record now and just saying how I came across your videos, because I've always been interested in what's actually responsible for change in people. What are these underlying processes? Because it feels really important to the average person for them to know about this, not to waste too much time in the form of an intervention, but to go down to what's actually the meat and potatoes of the change that's being created. And your theory, which we're going to get into, struck me as something that is really important in this regard, in identifying an underlying core process that keeps people stuck and that can possibly help people change. So I think maybe you can just introduce your perceptual control theory and why you think it's so important.
Okay. So I think the first thing to say is that perceptual control theory, the first paper was published in 1960 by a man called William T. Powers, who was actually an engineer and a medical physicist. He wasn't even a psychologist. And he'd developed the ideas in the 1950s. I came across them in the late 90s. And it was at a time when I was doing my research in a clinical mental health arena, working particularly with people who'd experienced trauma and social anxiety, and found the striking commonalities between the ways that people were trying to deal with their problems that were very similar across all these different diagnoses that they'd been given. And I was also obviously listening to people's accounts and reading about people's accounts. And one theme that came through again and again was control and loss of control. People wanting to get back control of their life, people losing control of their emotions and their behavior in a panic attack, losing control of their mind in a psychotic breakdown, losing control of their eating. People just in a state where they're stuck, and some of the things they took for granted in their everyday life, they just, maybe through depression, can't motivate themselves to do, or can't face some of the anxiety and fear that they might experience trying to make small steps to get more control of their lives. So this theme of control just came up again and again. And so I looked up and tried to find how control was explained. And I think sometimes the best way to explain something is to try and show how it works, try and model it. And Bill Powers, back in the 60s and 70s, had explained control by trying to model it. He'd actually built artificial systems that control, and the simplest examples of those are things like the thermostat in your house, and incubators, servo mechanisms in aircraft. We actually rely on control systems for everyday life in the modern world, and they're based originally on understanding how the body controls, which is, many people will know, homeostasis. It's the way that our brainstem manages all the our body temperature and the concentration of salt ions and glucose in our blood, etc. Our breathing rate, our heart rate, all of these things are control systems. And Bill Power's idea was that behavior is just part of another control loop, but rather than it circulating within the body, it's one that comes out of the body in your actions through what you're walking on, holding, manipulating in the world, and back in through your senses again. So it's not a sort of a step-by-step stimulus response process at all. What we're actually seeing is a section of a loop. And actually what's really going on is our brain is constantly trying to get the experiences in our senses and in our bodies that we want, that we prefer, to get the right feelings of pleasure, the right kind of level of comfort, the right level of excitement, the right sense of being clear when I explain things, and that's Bill's idea. Was that is what life is about, and that's what psychology is. This constant adjustment of all these variables that we need to control and balance to have a smooth and healthy life.
Okay, great. I think you did a good job of explaining quite a tricky concept there. Well, what I'm hearing you say is that a lot of this is about experience, regulating our experience in some way. Well, not control itself for all of these other aspects, but in the way that's relevant to you and to me as psychologists. It's how someone regulates that experience, their own experience. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're doing it all the time. We're self-helping all the time, regardless of whether we've read a book on it.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I'm glad to hear that, because it's so relevant for this podcast. We're self-helping all the time. We're trying to regulate our experience. So what are some of the ways in which we do that? Is it just through our behavior, or is it also these internal processes like thinking, emotions? Is it unconscious? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's mainly two different types of things, I would say. It's so almost automatically and all the time we're using our behavior to control things in a quite a habitual way. When we walk, when we drive, when we speak, we don't have to think about every word that we're putting together in a sentence. So our behavior is clearly the kind of the basis of control, everyday control. But all the time, there are glitches and clashes and things that don't quite fit and things that need to be prioritized more than others. And arguably, that's where consciousness and what's called reorganization comes in. So it's as though there's a kind of a constant sort of scanning process, trying to work out where is best to be updating stuff right now to make things smoother, to reduce indecision, to kind of manage decisions that we're not sure about. And so that's where our conscious sort of gravitates to. And then the longer we keep our awareness on that thing that we're struggling with, the more this process called reorganization is allowed to kick in and make a difference. And it's a very basic thing. It's just a trial and error alteration of the way we think, making new connections, kind of perceiving things in a slightly different way, slightly adjusting priorities. It's all these kind of this sort of tinkering that goes on in a very spontaneous and somewhat random way. It's kind of analogous to variation in evolution, natural selection, but it's within our brain. And what makes it work is when it can sustain on something that we're bothered about. And so this comes to what's the active ingredient of therapy. The case in PCT is it's literally just a context where you can hold a problem in mind for long enough to solve it through some of these changes and alterations in neural connections.
Okay. Could you give an example of being able to hold a problem in mind long enough to be able to solve it.
Yeah. I mean, in a basic way, it starts with being willing and able to talk about the problem. And, for many of us, the issues that end up becoming interfering with our lives are the ones that we don't want to, or we can't put into words because we're too embarrassed about them. We don't feel that other people would listen helpfully. Other people try and help, but maybe not in helpful ways. So the first step is just expressing that problem. Talking is the classic way, but it could be through writing or art in some other form. And that sustained engagement with the problem, all the different elements of it, the thoughts, the feelings, the impulses, the images, the memories, whatever comes to mind, and keeping that focus. So I think that's where the second point comes in, which is it's not just a choice to talk about a problem, but it's in the moment choosing to stay with the thoughts and the feelings, the images that come to mind in relation to it. And in Method of Levels therapy, which is the therapy directly derived from PCT, that's literally all the therapist does. Give them free rein to talk about the problem of their choice, asking curiously about it, and then helping the person notice these different sort of fleeting and background and sort of fringe experiences in relation to the problem that they might otherwise ignore or choose to just keep to the back of their mind.
Uh-huh. And so before we go into Method of Levels, why is that kept at the back of our minds? Is that part of the trying to regulate our experiences in the ways that we prefer?
It's just normal everyday life. You've got to get on with stuff. You've got work to do. You've got kids to feed. You can't spend all the time contemplating and introspecting. You just got to put it at the back for a while. But that doesn't mean you can put it to the back forever. You need some time in your day. And I think it was famously Barack Obama who said that when he became president, he was worried that he wouldn't have any time to contemplate his life in his day. And I think there's this recognition in many people that we need that sort of free rein every so often to let our mind wander, to kind of freely express, to kind of confide. And that is it's just a bit of spring cleaning that our brain needs to do every day or so. It just needs a space to do it. But the rest of the time, just shove it to the back and get on with what you're doing. That's fine as well.
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking about my work in private practice as a clinical psychologist. It's just helpful in and of itself then just to have that sort of demarcated hour. It's just a box where you can actually be reflective, and it's a bit of a safe space where you can actually hold a problem in mind for a while. And something I noticed in therapy is this concept you speak about of goal. I think you call it goal conflict. Is that is that right? So my understanding so far is that we are constantly trying to regulate our experience in certain ways through our behavior, through other means. But we're doing that not just in relation to a single goal. We've constantly got a multitude of goals. We all have many goals at many different levels, some biological, some psychological, whatever else. And then I think you speak about this idea that these goals can come into conflict, and that sometimes we're unaware that they're in conflict, or maybe we're not prioritizing them in a way that will actually lead to long-lasting well-being or fulfillment. So can you speak a bit about goal conflict and what the importance is of it?
Yeah, I'll give you some classic clinical examples in a minute, but you could argue that every decision is a resolution of some form of goal conflict. So we have plenty of low-level goal conflicts regarding which room I do this interview in, regarding what I have for dinner. They are goal conflicts, but they're low-level everyday ones that probably aren't going to bother me for long. And I'll come to a decision. But there are some goal conflicts that are more chronic and more high-level ones. So, as an example, within a clinical arena, a person who's been the victim of violence or attack and is traumatized because of that, they well have two very strong goals or others, but one of those might be to get justice, that this person needs to be caught and brought to justice. And another goal might be to not be distressed, to not lose your mind. But if your way of not losing your mind is to try and not think about what happened because it's too distressing, too destabilizing, then how are you going to be an accurate witness for what happened to you to describe in detail to other people, including the police and the courts, to get justice? And so this kind of conflict is often really troubling and extreme in certain cases. For example, in rape attacks, where it's the victim feels so vulnerable to recount the evidence of what they've remembered. So that's a very profound example of a goal conflict. There are also ones that are clinically relevant that are more everyday. So most people have some kind of fear or phobia, whether it be spiders or heights or blood and injury. And what makes that a problem is the conflict. It's not because you're scared of a spider. If I never see a spider again and I don't need to see a spider, the fact that I'm terrified of spiders is kind of irrelevant. It's not going to bother me at all. But if I need to go on a camping holiday and there's big pressure from, my family to kind of go into an area where I know there might be spiders, for example, then there's a conflict. If I'm quite shy and I don't really like being asked difficult questions and feel put on the spot, that might be okay if I have a job where I don't need to, and if I kind of generally mix with close friends. But if actually I really want this other job that I've seen and I'm going to have to go to an interview and even give a presentation, then suddenly it becomes a problem. So from a PCT perspective, what makes a problem isn't the nature of the thing itself, it's the conflict. Another classic example in the traditional approach is one may think that a negative thought is a problem. I'm going to make a total fool of myself. Surely that's a problem. Well, it's not if your profession is a clown and the time you have that thought is when you're performing in front of people, because that's your job. It fits with your goal. So essentially, problems are all relative problems. PCT is a theory of relativity of the mind, essentially, because it proposes that what makes something an issue is how it's related to another goal that the person has.
Yeah, that I just had a bit of a light bulb moment here, because
they're always good.
Yeah,
that's our higher level system coming in there.
Nice. A bit of a resolution. So I think the idea that someone's goal is in conflict with something else that they're doing, because whatever else they're doing is some other goal, right? So it's always, and I'm just thinking about my clients in therapy. They often come with a tension. There's some sort of tension, and if there's no internal tension there, well, I'm calling it internal tension, but I'm thinking of it as goal conflict now. But if there's no internal tension there, they often don't even make it to therapy, because they're just pursuing whatever they need to. There's nothing else that they're in conflict with. But in terms of therapy, what I've been finding really helpful is identifying the parts, the different parts within my clients, a bit like an internal family systems model, where you bring to light the different parts of the person. And as you're speaking, I'm realizing that partly what I've been doing is helping their different goals become illuminated, so that they can find some sort of compromise between those goals. Is that, would I be tapping into something here similar?
Absolutely. What we need to remember is goal is just a word that me and you happen to be using and that I've used in some papers. But from a PCT perspective, what's going on is that we're trying to control the experience we're having at all kinds of levels. When that's at a really low level, it might just look like a behavior. If I'm just sort of gripping a cup, that looks like a behavior, but it's actually a very little goal where I'm trying to maintain a certain grasp tension in the cup. Okay, but I'll have something that's more like a goal, which is to drink the water. Okay. But actually, that's a sort of a mid-level. What goes on at higher levels is things that we tend to call our principles or values, standards, ideals, identities, self and world concepts or ideals. So in PC, these are just words that people have been using that approximate to different levels in this hierarchy. But what matters to PCT is there is a hierarchy that goes from the very concrete to the very abstract and back down again.
So,
and it seems like other therapies and other theories choose to use certain. Those words are just sticky for what actually is a system that doesn't use words. It's a very complex, multi-leveled system.
Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to check in with an example here of when I invited you to the podcast. I had the goal of my broader goal here is to help make these really good psychological theories and techniques more accessible to people. And then within that, I had the goal of inviting you to the podcast. And then I had the goal of sending you an email. And then my fingers had the goal of hitting these type keys. Is that an example of a nested structure?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So in line with that, in line with the fact that we have all these goals, we have a variety of goals going left and right and up and down. How does inflexible control, which you identify as the underlying process that keeps us stuck, how does inflexible control link to the fact that we have all these different goals?
Yeah, well, it's kind of what I was saying before is that we need to allow our conscious awareness to drift around this system to where it needs to tidy up and pick up and resolve the conflicts. And that our brains do that nicely for us. They have this little thing called sort of background consciousness or intrusions, spontaneous thoughts to awareness. That's our brain doing its job to say, there's something not quite working right here, or something you need to attend to here. And we just need to go with that, so at least some of the time. The idea is that when people don't go with that, they choose not to go with that, maybe because those things that pop into their awareness are frightening or don't feel part of themselves or overwhelming, or they just miss them. Then they're going to persist with doing things, carrying out goals that don't take into account the side effects of them, the impacts on other people, the long-term impacts on themselves, etc. But a goal has a blind. Every time we do choose to do something, we have blind spots, and every flexible to some degree. You have to focus on something right now. So it's kind of relative sense, but the best we can do is to allow our minds to drift and allow ourselves to ponder and think about, talk about, write about what's looking like it might be a problem, what's looking like some mixed feelings or some conflict going on, and to sit with it long enough so that we could approach it in a different way.
Okay, great. So I'd like you to just maybe, you've already started describing method of levels, I assume. So you can maybe just, if there's anything to add there, you're welcome to add it. And then maybe just, tell us about this therapeutic approach. Yeah,
and then I presume you want to me to tell you a bit more about how it's used more in a self-help context.
Yes, we can jump into that afterwards.
Yeah. So again, I mean, put simply, method of levels is a conversation between two people where one of them has a problem that they're bothered by that they haven't resolved, and the other one is trying to help the person resolve the problem. But within meta levels, they're helping them purely through holding two goals. One through the curious questioning about the problem, and the other is about what we call asking about disruptions. But essentially, it's about helping the person talking about the problem notice these background thoughts, these elements that pop into awareness or at the edge of awareness. It's also important often that when that person starts to talk about them, that the therapist helps them focus on them and ask questions to help them then look at it. And all of this is kind of grounded in an assumption that the client knows best in terms of how often they want therapy, how long they want to talk about, what's an important problem to talk about. So typically people will book sessions when they need them, as regularly as they need them, and then choose to not book them when they don't. So it's very much about respecting the client's autonomy and control, not just in also the booking process and the choice process of therapy.
Okay, great. Yeah, and then I'd love to transition, which is the main point of this podcast, into what the implication is of this way of thinking, of the techniques that are used for self-help and for people who are just feeling stuck in their lives in some way.
Yeah, super. When I could start with this chronologically, the first avenue I took within self-help was a book that I wrote called Coping with Fears and Phobias. And that was published in 2007. And some of that book is will be familiar to people who know about exposure therapy and cognitive approaches. But also because I was taking this control theory approach at the time and writing it, I was really trying to consider how to empower the reader to take control of this process themselves, how to work out how to break down facing a fear into manageable steps, and taking those steps for themselves, by themselves, in a way that works, in a way that they can see when they sit with that step for long enough, maybe just standing 5 meters from a height that they're afraid of, even though there's probably a gate there or something, but they're still afraid of it. But standing away from it a certain, a small distance, but sitting with that for a longer time that they choose, and helping them sort of self-reflect on what they've learned from that experience, helping to think about it in a way that accepts the fact that this is a conflict. There's parts of them that really want to just overcome this fear straight away, but parts of them that's terrified of even facing it, and helping them to kind of deal with that two sides of themselves by breaking it down into manageable chunks, where the bit of them that's motivated to deal with it holds back just to kind of set something that's manageable, so that the side of them that's very terrified of that can actually have a chance of kind of managing that in a way that doesn't overwhelm them. So that book, 2007, was just a way of explaining that classic approach of exposure therapy to an individual who doesn't have access to therapy, so that they can go through the process and take it in these manageable steps, essentially.
Okay, can I just ask a question there about the conflict resolution in that process? Because it almost seems that it's assumed that the goal that should be prioritized there in an example like that is the goal, the higher order goal, I want to say, of being able to overcome your fears. Whereas, is that the case, or would there be situations where you have a phobia?
Yeah, no.
It's fine to just avoid it.
Yeah, it's not a higher order goal because relative to the goal of saving your own life, you could argue that if the fear is that you're going to die, that actually stopping dying is a more important goal. Even though for most people in these situations, people might argue it's not a realistic goal, but in terms of whether it's higher or lower, that need for survival is clearly an important goal that people have, or vital goal. So yeah, this is literally about helping the person work out for themselves how much of a priority this is right now, and is this the time to face this fear and overcome it, or is it not the right time right now because there's ways around it, there's ways to manage despite this anxiety. And it's about helping people to explore both sides. So explore, what could I do if I wasn't afraid of this thing? What difference would it make in my life? How good would that be? But at the same time, what am I worried is going to happen? How bad would that be? How would that work out? So help the people to kind of see both sides of it. And I think many people find that very validating, because they can see that, it's not an irrational fear. It's something that, if it did happen, it would just kind of ruin my life. So no wonder I've got that side of me that wants to protect myself. But I can kind of convince that side of myself to take this small step, and that will actually still allow me to move forward and start to feel like I'm overcoming the fear without me really believing that I'm going to harm myself. So the more you help people to really explore both sides, the more they make a decision that moves one way or the other. And for certain conflicts, it might work the other way around. So for someone who wants to overcome a drug addiction, for example, it might be that they need to remind themselves more of the bad things that might happen and less of the good things that they get out of it. So it does very much depend on what the actual conflict is and where that conflict sits in a person's life. And that's where something like Method of Levels would help the person explore that much more deeply than a self-help book, although we have got some other techniques that I can talk to you about next.
Yeah, I'd love to go into that chronological order you were speaking about. Just before I do go there, something that occurred to me as you were speaking was that in the therapy, I think I heard you say once that the identifying the therapist's role is to ask questions, mainly to help the client sort of identify these things for themselves. So you're asking them these questions that will help clarify the importance of these goals and in which direction to move. But I'm just thinking, for someone who doesn't have a therapist around, and they're let's say someone has severe social anxiety, and they have this really important goal to them of public speaking, to be able to spread some important message they have, and it's really important to them, and they have the severe social anxiety. I imagine a person who has that sort of goal conflict, it might almost be easier to want to go the side of just reducing the social anxiety by avoiding these, difficult social situations, trying to control the social anxiety, because I imagine there might be more of an almost immediate emotion involved on the side of almost siding with the social anxiety, rather than the maybe what feels maybe a bit of a distant dream that doesn't feel maybe as emotionally charged, perhaps. Would someone like that, is there a possibility that someone like that might be choosing the goal that leads to less distress in the moment over a goal that would lead to more well-being and fulfillment in the long term?
Yeah, and that's actually related to what I was going to talk about next, which is our approach called 4Ds, the 4Ds for dealing with distress, because that appreciates the fact that people have short-term and long-term ways of regaining control over their lives. So again, it's very natural for all of us and any of us, like I said right at the start, to get on with our lives and do what's easy, to distract ourselves, to do the things we need to do, in terms of work and family life, because they need to be done anyway, and they're pleasurable, and they're working towards something. So it's actually part of a fabric of our life that we do everyday goals, and find a way round achieving what we want to achieve without addressing these fears and these problems. And in 4Ds, we call that distract. It's also very understandable that some people want to find techniques or training approaches to try and deal with some of these unresolved feelings that are just distracting them, that are troubling them, that are upsetting them. And that's where people learn certain approaches, whether that be slow breathing, applied relaxation, maybe potentially some elements of mindfulness training and thought challenging are involved in that kind of what we call dilution of an emotional impact. And that's the second D in the 4Ds. And both of these are valid everyday ways that all of us sometimes manage our distress. And sometimes they work really well, sometimes they open doors to other things. But if we exclusively did those, like I was saying at the start, and never started to try and face the problem, the issue that we kind of know is there, then that stress is not going to go in the long term. We're just going to kind of take it out of our awareness for a while. And as I was saying, method of levels is the therapeutic way to help that person face those fears. So is some of this kind of exposure for when it relates particularly to a fear, like I just talked about. But within the 4Ds, we've also brought together some other strategies or other approaches that are out there. One of these, very simply, is something that some other therapies have used, and it's called worry time. It's just the idea of choosing some time in your day when you do allow yourself to think about your problem and think about what's distressing you, but just that time in your day, so that you can get on with all the other things, but at the same time, you're not forgetting that there's something to be sorted out and resolved here, and you have an allocated time in your day for it, for that mind wandering, that mental space, and what we call discovery. So that's just one example of what we call a developed strategy to help make discovery work. And then discovery itself, if you like, the gold standard is finding someone who could do method levels therapy. But we have other ways that head towards that. One is an approach that's already out there, which is free writing. So just getting a paper and pen and just writing what's in your mind, what's at the front of your mind, what's popped into your mind, forgetting about punctuation or grammar or anything, and just letting it out onto the page. And it's interesting how within just a few minutes, you can find yourself noticing elements or perspectives on a problem that you didn't start with. So that's a very kind of easy approach. We also have something called the upward arrow approach, which is where you start free writing, you start writing about a problem, but then you pause and ask yourself, what bothers me so much about that? And you draw an arrow going upwards and then start writing again about what bothers you about the problem that you just talked about. And then you stop again when you've described the answer to that, draw another arrow and ask yourself, what bothers me about that? And you just keep doing this for as long as you need to until you start to get to the root of what this problem is for you in your life. So it's a way of going up levels that doesn't require a therapist doing method levels, if that makes sense. And the other way to make it more this whole therapy democratic is to consider method of levels, as I say, of the gold standard of applying this theory. But any of us, with or without a mental health qualification, can head in that direction and can say, at the end of the day, I want to, when I talk to someone about a problem, I want to be the kind of person who can just keep that authentic curiosity, listen and ask questions and help them notice the thoughts and feelings as they're talking about it. I know it's really hard to do, and method level therapists are trained in it, but I'm going to go in that direction. And discovery talk is about any person going in that direction, listening for a bit longer to someone who wants to talk about a problem, maintaining that curiosity, not jumping in with a solution if it's something that can wait, obviously, and just helping that other person explore. And so discovery talk is about, even within workplace settings, helping people listen to each other about what's on their nerves, what's bugging them, in a way that's more constructive, gives a bit more chance for people in the room to come up with a new perspective on it than just kind of falling back on sort of ways of coping that don't work.
Yeah.
So that's a sort of 4D suite of stuff that we developed from PCT. And what we tend not to do 4Ds in one-to-one work. 4Ds is deliberately brought together so you can actually deliver and explain that, a bit like I am now, to hundreds of people at once, so that they can see the point of it and then try it out without having to themselves be listened to by another person. But when we do 4Ds live, people can log in on their own computers and they can try out free writing, and then people can share their experiences on the chat. So it gives this nice combination of confidentiality, but also a shared experience. And that's been a really kind of positive direction for this approach.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, there's so much value in those last 10 minutes. I think I could chunk out I think five to 10 different things that people could try out for themselves. So I appreciate all the value.
Yeah, well, it's an open access article on Frontiers. If you just look up 4Ds for dealing with distress, so people can see what it's all about.
Great. Great. Yeah. And I'd love to, at the end, just have you direct people to some helpful resources and also just anything related to your work. But I wanted to check in first about that chronological order that you were heading in. Was there anything else that you wanted to add there in terms of?
Well, I guess the other thing, it started over a decade ago, but we have Milo, which is our artificial method of levels therapist. So it's a way that a person can explore a problem as they would do in method levels, but through their smartphone device. So they text what's on their minds, what's bothering them, and then the app asks them a question about that. Then they say more. Then it asks them a question about that. So it's a very simple process. All the app needs to do is find keywords and phrases and themes of what the person's talking about to ask a question that's authentically curious. It's kind of the opposite of ChatGPT, because Milo knows nothing and wants to know about the user, which is kind of the opposite of how people use ChatGPT. And we've developed Milo quite considerably recently. It's still within the research and development phase, but we are moving towards a point where we can make it more widely available.
Yeah, very interesting. I'd love to get ChatGPT and Milo in a room, see what they come up with.
Depends whether ChatGPT thinks it has problems or not.
Yeah, I guess so. If there's any goal conflicts there, If AI ever tries to take over the world, we can maybe get Milo in to just sort of help them resolve those terrestrial conflicts.
But it'll only want to do it if AI thinks it's a problem for itself. Otherwise, it won't.
Yeah. Why Milo? Why that name? Is it an acronym?
Oh, it stands for Manage Your Life Online.
Oh, okay. Great. Yeah, I think this is extremely valuable. As we're landing the plane, I want to ask you a bit about your own life, if you've ever used method of levels in your own life, to whatever degree you're comfortable sharing. Do you think about your own life in this way? And if so, has there ever been like circumstances where you embody this theory on a daily basis?
Absolutely. So we have supervision for method levels, international supervision every 2 weeks. And when we do that, we all take it in turns to be the client, and we often take it in turns to be the therapist. So you see this interesting benefit of being asked questions by different people, but it's also a chance for any of us just to work through a problem that we're getting bothered by at the moment. Sometimes I'll also ask friends or family to have a conversation along these lines when we're kind of stuck with something, and that helps. And then when I have had counselling in my time, it's when I've actually got it professionally, it's not been method levels because there's not that many around. But actually, what I've noticed is it's that opportunity to describe and explore and kind of look at a problem from different angles that's really helped. And sometimes when the counsellors come in with their own ideas, that's kind of derailed it a bit for me. And that's like, oh yeah, I can see how this kind of works for that reason too. So that's the idea, is essentially that all therapies work. They all have this active ingredient, but different other therapies have elements that may or may not kind of enhance that active ingredient.
Okay, great. So before I ask you, where people can find you and where they should go to learn a bit more about your work, what are some key points that you would give to someone based on, all this knowledge and expertise, the research that you've done, everything that you know thus far? If you took your brain and distilled it into just a few points for people who are stuck in some way in their lives, what are some things you would want them to know based on what you know?
One thing is that if you're conscious, then your mind is working on stuff. So the fact that you're awake and conscious means that you've got this opportunity to work through a problem and to find a way out and to see it in a new way, because that is what our conscious awareness does. All you need to do is help focus it on what's at the root of the problem. And it's about finding what works. Finding what works for you, I think, is another take-home message. Don't think that it has to be therapy, or it has to be a certain type of therapy, or it has to be even writing or talking. It just needs to be what works for you. It'll probably involve putting your mind to something that's bothering you, but allowing some of this spontaneous stuff to happen. But how you find your way in that, what you choose to be your medium, is completely up to you, and it's going to work around whatever your life goals are, whatever you see as your limitations or your own preferences in life. Some people get it when they go fishing, talking to someone else. Some people get it when they go out for a jog or a walk in the countryside. There's different ways that people can get into this. Could just drift, allow their mind to drift to really what's going on here, and noticing a different way of managing it and a way through it.
Yeah, I love that emphasis on the individualized treatment. I think the world is moving toward that in medicine, genetics. This seems like one way in which
it is, but 90% of that is expert driven. So it's this idea that you give this data to some system, then that system comes back and tells you what's personalized. I think just cut out the middleman and just do what feels right and learn from your experiences as to what's working, because the alternative is very inefficient, I think, and potentially at risk of people being drawn down the line that other people might think works, but instinctively you've got to go with kind of what's working for you at the moment. Keep an open mind, but go with what's working for you right now.
Yeah, beautiful. Where can people find you and the work that you do?
I think, as you said, the YouTube channel is probably where there's the most kind of accessible descriptions and examples of what I do. So I think if you go to the YouTube channel, which you could put a link on from here, that's the most obvious one. If you want to know more about PCT, then there's a website called iapct.org, and a lot of it's quite academic, but there's also some really accessible intros there. And other than that, I would just say I'm quite active on Twitter. So if you follow me on Twitter and look through the threads, then again, that's a pointer to all the latest stuff. I mean, there's also obviously my university websites at Curtin and also the University of Manchester one, where I'm still an honorary academic. But I think probably, the YouTube channel and the Twitter stream are where you're going to get the more live access to what I'm producing and publishing and researching and what have you.
Okay, Professor Mansell, thank you for your generosity with your time and your knowledge as well. I think there's lots of value in what you just spoke about, and I appreciate that. So thank you.
No worries.